This is the chart of the biggest oil producers in the world. And to the surprise of many, the United States is the world's largest oil producer. In fact, last year, the US produced an average 21 million barrels of petroleum per day. And we only consumed around 20 million barrels per day, meaning we have more than enough oil being pumped out here to cover our needs. But we still import a lot of oil from other countries, especially from OPEC countries. Which raises the question, why? Why is it we're so dependent on the Middle East and so careful as to not piss off other countries like Saudi Arabia in the hope of never losing their oil supply? Why does the US export the oil it produces and import oil from other countries? Well, in this video, let's dive deeper into the paradox of American oil. Let's start with the fact that the US is the biggest oil producer, even though we only have the 11th biggest oil reserve. The US's output is actually bigger than commonly known oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia, Russia, or Iran. But when it comes to oil reserves, the picture changes dramatically. As per the most recent data, the United States only has approximately 36.5 billion barrels of oil in its reserves. Now, I know billions sounds like a lot, but for comparison, the leading country in terms of oil reserves, Venezuela, has around 302.8 billion barrels of oil. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Canada, and Iran also possess oil reserves significantly larger than the United States. Then how are we producing so much oil? Well, this has more to do with how we produce oil and our policies when it comes to saving it for rainy days. You see, countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar don't like pumping out as much oil as they can every day. They are more strategic with their production. They control it as to not flood the market with oil and crash the prices. After all, these countries are very heavily dependent on oil sales for their economic output. There's no better way for me to explain it in words, so I will explain it using my favorite thing in the world, charts. Here you can see Saudi Arabia's GDP and crude oil prices. The correlation is pretty simple. Oil prices go up, then the economy goes up. And oil prices go down, the economy goes down. This is where a kind of problem arises. Countries like Saudi Arabia are extremely dependent on oil prices, but they have no control over it at all. You see, the oil market is bigger, a lot of buyers and sellers. If a country like Iran wants to pump a lot of oil because of war, then prices will crash, and other oil-dependent countries like Saudi Arabia suffer because of this. So in the 90s, Saudi Arabia came up with a solution that shocked the world. In the later section of the video, we will talk more about this, but for now, you just need to know that to control the prices, countries like Saudi Arabia carefully control how much they produce on a daily basis. The US, on the other hand, doesn't care much about keeping oil prices high. In fact, we kind of want our prices as low as possible. That's because we are dependent on oil too, but in the opposite sense of Saudi Arabia. We love using oil, and that means we are a buyer, so we want the prices to be low. That's why the US has aggressively exploited its reserves to produce as much oil as possible. More oil in the market, lower the prices. This strategy, combined with advancements in extraction technology and techniques, has made the US the largest oil producer, despite having a smaller reserve base. Even though now the US has a lot of oil production, that wasn't always the case. And looking at the reason and history behind this helps us understand why, even today, the US doesn't like using its own oil. In the early 1900s, the world and the US had very little need for oil, which meant oil was never in short supply. But the chaotic ramp to World War I changed all of that. Compared to energy sources like coal, petroleum proved to be more flexible as it could be transported with ease and used in different types of vehicles. That in itself represented a new type of weapon and a basic strategic advantage. Because of this, the US Navy decided to secure important resources on oil imports from Mexico and the Caribbean. Alas, this dependency got disrupted by German U-boat attacks. The dire situation ignited a nationwide drive to tap into domestic oil reserves, prompting the government to pour resources into exploration and production. This always opened the leaders' eyes to how important oil was to national security. This awakening led to the foundation of the US Navy's Bureau of Mines in 1910. The Bureau really made a huge impact on oil extraction and refining technologies, especially during the wartime rush. They were all about making sure oil could be transported efficiently over long distances using pipelines. And because everyone was after oil, the United States became a major player in the global petroleum scene. States like Texas, Oklahoma, and California were sitting on massive amounts of oil, turning the US into a big oil exporter and giving it a prime spot in the global oil market. By 1914, the US was producing a remarkable 70% of the world's oil. As World War I started, the surge in US oil production, which increased by about 50%, really helped out with the war efforts. When the war was over, US oil production had gone over 500 barrels. But when the war was ongoing, the British Navy switching from coal to oil really showed how important oil was in naval warfare, and how it impacted the global stage. As impressive as the US domestic oil production was from 1900 to 1920, the real revolution occurred on the international scene, as British, Dutch, and French European powers used corporations such as Shell, British Petroleum, and others to begin developing oil wherever it occurred. Clearly, countries were catching on to how important oil was going to be for the future. But something else also happened here in the US after the war that drastically increased our need for oil. On the 7th of July, 1919, a group of US military members that included future President Dwight D. Eisenhower set out on an expedition. The goal was to go from east coast to west coast of the country and explore conditions of American roads by driving all the way. The expedition results were shocking. American roads were not good, to put it simply. For days, the group averaged a travel speed of just 5 miles per hour. Eisenhower saw how roads, national security, and petroleum were all connected, and he made it his mission to push for better transportation systems for the country's benefit. Quick side note, later on when he was president, Eisenhower signed legislation funding the construction of the US interstate highway systems. Alright, so coming back to our story, as the world dealt with the aftermath of the war, everyone was, scrambling for oil. The big oil companies were becoming a big deal, showing just how critical petroleum was in shaping global relationships and security plans. It's fascinating how countries were going all out to get their hands on oil reserves, even redrawing maps based on energy needs, especially in places like the Middle East. This connection between transportation, petroleum, and national security really shows how everything is intertwined in shaping the world stage of energy dependence. As we shifted to oil-powered warfare, having enough petroleum became crucial for protecting our interests and maintaining stability. So in order to compensate for the ever-growing demand for oil, the US kept searching for cheap foreign oil. That's when US dependency on foreign oil started. The real initial dependence goes all the way back to the late 1930s, when Arabian nations started getting into oil drilling and export. The Middle East, famous for its oil reserves, had its challenges turning it into a global product. They began exploring in the early 1930s and hit the jackpot with the Dammam oil well in Saudi Arabia in 1938. As they ramped up drilling, led by Saudi Arabia, they became major players in the global oil market. Not only did they have massive oil reserves, but they could also extract and refine oil much cheaper than others. Their smart investments and favorable location made all the difference. But having oil and extracting it efficiently wasn't enough. They needed a market, too. Global industrialization, especially in the US, created the perfect opportunity. With the demand for oil soaring, especially for industry and automobiles, these Arabian nations were in the perfect spot to meet that demand. These countries started making money hand over feet, and all due to something that was just sitting under their feet. But then, good competition started eating into countries' margins. First, the Soviet Union started offering cheaper oil. Then the Middle East. Then Western countries are undercutting their prices, and it seemed like a war to the bottom had started. This is when major oil-producing countries got together and decided to form OPEC to have some control over oil prices by controlling supply. It was a cartel. Sort of. It's legal when countries are doing it, but illegal when companies do it. It was a game changer for these nations, giving them a platform to coordinate their oil production policies, which allowed them to wield significant influence on global oil prices. This smart move made these nations key players in the global energy scene. Their impact is so huge that any shifts in the production levels can create ripples throughout the global economy. Despite growing interest in alternative energy sources, their position as primary oil suppliers remains unchallenged. As the US's thirst for oil grew, the country experienced a notable rise in oil imports. This increased reliance on foreign oil became apparent during the oil supply crisis in the 70s, pushing the US to seek energy independence through options like nuclear power. However, even with these efforts, the US still needed to continue importing oil. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, the US backed Israel, leading oil-producing Arab nations to strike back by halting oil exports to the US. This incident exposed the vulnerability of the US's oil supply and made the US government reconsider its energy diversification strategies. Following this disastrous event, President Nixon addressed the nation about the energy crisis and remarked about the importance of reducing foreign oil dependency. To tackle the issue, there was a need for fresh approaches in oil extraction. This conflict, involving Israel and an Arab coalition led by Egypt and Syria, put significant pressure on the relationship between oil-producing countries and their international customers. And this led to a significant shift in America's energy policy. The Energy Policy Office and Federal Energy Administration, the FEA, were established, focusing on federal energy policy coordination, petroleum product prices, and allocation. Nixon also imposed price controls on petroleum products and launched Project Independence, aiming for energy self-reliance by 1980. Despite these efforts, U.S. dependence on foreign oil persists. The imposed price controls, though beneficial initially, were unsustainable in the long run, and ironically just worsened the problem. The U.S. continues to grapple with reconciling energy needs with foreign policy priorities, shaping its geopolitical relations. Despite being the top oil producer since 2008, the U.S. exports nearly one-third of its oil production while leaning heavily on imports. Now you might ask yourself, why would the U.S. export nearly one-third of its oil production? This peculiar situation arises because of the refining capacities and capabilities within the nation. Oil refineries are distinctly specialized facilities that process crude oil into a variety of refined products like gasoline, diesel fuel, heating oil, and jet fuel, amongst others. The type of oil that a refinery can process is determined by its configuration and the nature of the crude oil that it was designed to process. In the US, many refineries, particularly those on the East Coast and in the Gulf of Mexico, were built to handle heavier grades of crude oil imported from nations like Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and Canada. This heavier crude oil, characterized by its high density and viscosity, requires complex refining processes to break it down into useful end products. On the other hand, a substantial proportion of the oil extracted domestically, especially from regions like the Permian Basin and the Barnett Shale, is light, sweet crude. Light, sweet crude is less dense, has a lower sulfur content, and typically fetches a higher price on the global market as it is easier to turn into end products like gasoline. However, it can't be efficiently processed by refineries designed for heavy, sour crude, so large amounts of it are just exported. Unlike conventional oil fields where oil extraction simply involved a process of pumping, these unconventional reserves required the application of novel techniques such as fracking. The significant milestone was achieved by Michael P. Mitchell, who revolutionized the industry with the introduction of horizontal drilling. The technique dramatically increased the extraction rate, making the Barnett Shale the largest onshore natural gas field in the United States. Today, the Barnett Shale revolution remains important. It continues to be a significant contributor to the U.S.'s energy supply, providing a substantial portion of domestic natural gas. The techniques pioneered in the U.S. are now applied worldwide to extract oil and natural gas from unconventional reserves. But this wasn't the only contributor to the development of oil and gas extraction engineering. As mentioned before, fracking made the United States capable of producing significant amounts of oil independently. Even though in many countries fracking is unpopular due to the damage it does to nature and the areas where people live, the US still makes use of this technology. Now, I will explain in depth what fracking actually is. Fracking, a shortened term for hydraulic fracturing, stands as an extraction technique that has brought about a revolution in the oil and gas industry, tracing its roots back to the 1860s, where the use of explosives like nitroglycerin was instrumental in stimulating oil wells. This method laid the foundation for the evolution of contemporary fracking techniques. It wasn't until the late 1940s that hydraulic fracturing, as we recognize it today, emerged, thanks to the pioneering experiment conducted by Floyd Ferris in 1947. Fracking has been a game changer in the industry, allowing for increased extraction rates of water, petroleum, and natural gas from deep underground. It has opened up access to oil and gas resources in areas where traditional extraction methods fall short. In the United States, fracking has led to a significant boost in domestic oil production, reducing the country's reliance on foreign oil. Beyond the economic benefit, fracking has also played a role in supporting local economies, particularly in regions that have historically relied on traditional industries. States like Ohio and Pennsylvania have seen job growth and economic stability thanks to the mind-blowing technical innovation. While fracking has its perks, there are some pretty big downsides to think about. Concerns about the environment are a real issue, especially with things like methane emissions and water contamination. The whole process uses up a ton of water, and there's a risk it could mess with our drinking water, which is bad news for the environment and our health. And there's the whole thing about fracking possibly causing more earthquakes. When they get rid of all that fresh water from fracking, it can trigger earthquakes, leading to heated debates about how this industry affects the stability of the ground beneath us. Fracking has had a significant impact on oil and gas prices globally. By tapping into previously unreachable reserves, fracking has increased the overall supply of fossil fuels. Moreover, the fluctuation of oil prices, influenced by factors like supply and demand, has made the fracking industry vulnerable to economic shifts. The dip in oil prices in early 2020 really showed how shaky the industry can be. All in all, fracking has definitely changed the game in the oil and gas industry, bringing both opportunities and challenges. As technology gets better and people become more environmentally conscious, finding sustainable economic energy extraction practices is going to be the key for the future of energy independence. Finally, it's also worth mentioning that during the COVID-19 pandemic, oil companies suffered major financial losses, leading to scenarios where drillers exported expensive light sweet crude while importing cheaper heavy sour crude. This imbalance is exacerbated by the global nature of the oil market, where the US exporting its light sweet crude may not significantly impact prices unless legislation actions ban such exports. If the US were to restrict the export of domestic crude as it refined products, it could potentially lower gas prices significantly, considering that the break-even point for shale oil is around $40 to $50 per barrel. However, such a move could have repercussions on the global oil market, potentially causing disruptions if refining capacities were to go offline. A minor shortage in the global oil market can lead to significant price fluctuations, as evidenced by a mere few 100,000 barrels per day causing a 50% price increase. The impact of a few million barrels per day of refining capacity going down would be catastrophic on a global scale. To maintain consistent oil production, refineries here underwent modifications to primarily process heavy and medium sour crude imported from Saudi Arabia, along with a smaller proportion of light sweet crude from the Permian Basin. The US could possibly find a solution by updating its refineries to handle this new kind of oil that is not yet suitable for refineries. But there are two significant problems. First, the cost of such upgrades is very high due to the intricate systems of the refineries. Second, fossil fuel companies struggle to get funding for these projects as the world is shifting towards renewable energy sources. And financial institutions are becoming more skeptical about non-renewable energy sources. While the United States has made substantial advancements in oil production through innovation techniques like fracking, the path to self-sufficiency in oil production is still fraught with technical and financial barriers. Given these circumstances, oil imports will continue to play an important role in the American oil industry for the foreseeable future. This definitely won't be the last video on the US's dilemma of energy sources, so be sure to get subscribed and keep updated. As always, thanks for watching.